By the time the Pigeon found Ruth Calder, the ranch was already ash. She was on her knees in the blackened yard with soot in the lines of her palms and a dead lantern still clutched in one hand, digging through the warm wreck of what had been her kitchen when she heard the flutter overhead. Not hawkfast, not wild, familiar. A house bird, circling low over ruin as if it could not make sense of what it saw. Then it dropped to the broken hitch rail and stood there with one pink foot lifted, a brass message tube glinting against the gray morning. Ruth stared at it for one hard second too long. Then she went to it at a run. The note inside was written in her brother Jonah's cramped, hurried hand. Ruth, if this reaches you in time, leave Friday night. Take Millie and the deed copy from under the loft stone. Vainbach gulped. They mean to burn the house and call it lamp oil. Don't trust the badge. I am writing back if I can. Friday. Ruth looked up at the sky as if there might be something there worth cursing. It was Monday. For a moment the whole burned place went quiet around her. No wind through the cottonwoods. No creak from the ruined corral. Just the taste of old smoke at the back of her throat and the bird shifting on the rail. 2 days too late to save a house, a barn, 6 milk cows, and the life she had spent 14 years building one fence post at a time. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight. If you feel like it, let us know in the comments where you're listening from. There is something good about knowing who is sitting by the fire with us before the road gets dark again. Ruth folded the note once and slid it into her pocket. Then she lifted the pigeon in both hands. It trembled against her skin, exhausted nearly through to the bone. She could feel the tiny hammer of its heart. You did your best, she said. Behind her, little Millie called from what had been the smokehouse. Aunt Ruth. Ruth set the bird inside the shade of an overturned wash tub and turned. Millie stood barefoot in a borrowed coat 3 sizes too large, her braid half burned at one end, holding a scorched skillet as if it were treasure. She was 12 and trying not to cry in the brisk, pitiless light of morning. Found your mama's pan, the girl said. Ruth swallowed once. Good girl. Set it with the rest. The rest amounted to a skillet, 2 spoons, Jonah's note, a singed family Bible, 3 blankets, and a sack of meal that smelled faintly of smoke but was still dry in the middle. Everything else had either burned straight through or sat blackened and useless under the wreck of the roof. Ruth had not cried when the flames took the barn. She had not cried when the mare Daisy kicked free with her mane smoking. She had not cried when the rafters over the kitchen gave way with a sound like God splitting kindling. She had spent grief already, years earlier, when fever took her husband Ben in the back room, while summer flies droned against the window screen, and he apologized with his last clear breath for leaving her alone with land that wanted more from a person than most people had to give. Now she stood, wiped the soot across her skirt, and walked to the pigeon loft. Or what was left of it. The low stone foundation still held. Part of the floorboards had dropped inward. One wall leaned drunkenly. But the flat limestone slab Ben had once set near the back corner looked untouched under a drift of gray ash. Millie, Ruth said, go sit by the trough and keep that bird in the shade. Millie nodded and obeyed at once. She had that in her. When fear came, she got quieter, not louder. Ruth knelt at the loft foundation and shoved her burned fingers under the slab. Pain went white and hot up her hands, but she gritted her teeth and lifted. Beneath the stone lay an oilcloth packet, dry as bone. When she opened it, she found a folded deed copy, 3 county tax notices with the amounts altered in a different ink, and a page torn from a ledger. Across the top was the neat printed letterhead of Vain Cattle and Mercantile. Beneath it, in handwriting Ruth did not know, were 3 lines. To S. Galt, for night watch, as agreed. To T. Harrow, for transfer docket priority. To B. Creel, for delayed dispatch. Ruth read it twice. Then a horse snorted from the lane. She rose fast enough to make the world sway. A rider was coming through the cottonwoods leading a second horse by the reins. He sat tall, but not straight, like a man who had known injury and taught himself to live around it. Dust covered his coat. His hat brim shadowed half his face. The horse he led was Daisy. Millie made a sound halfway between relief and fear. Aunt Ruth, that's Daisy. I can see that. The rider stopped well short of the yard and looked over the ruins without speaking. That earned him a small measure of Ruth's respect. Men too eager to talk around grief usually had nothing worth hearing. Found her 2 miles north, he said at last. She let me catch her after she near bit me for trying. Ruth walked to the mare and laid a hand against the white blaze between Daisy's eyes. The horse shuddered once and settled. Smoke still clung to her hide. Thank you, Ruth said. The rider's gaze dropped to Ruth's hands, red and blistered from lifting stone. Need salve on those. I need a barn, 6 cows, and the kind of sheriff who does not sleep through arson. Something flickered in his face at that. Not surprise. Recognition. My name's Elias Mercer, he said. I came down from Box Elder Road this morning. Saw the smoke from a ridge. Then you saw what's left. He looked toward the house ruins. Anyone dead? Not here. Not here meant maybe somewhere else, and they both knew it. Jonah had written he was riding back. He should have been home by Friday night. Elias dismounted slowly, favoring one leg, and looped Daisy's reins over the hitch rail. He moved like a man used to being watched for weakness and determined not to provide a clear look at it. What said it? He asked. Ruth took Jonah's note from her pocket and held it out. He read in silence. When he reached the line about the badge, his jaw tightened. Then he handed it back carefully, as if the paper itself had become evidence the moment he touched it. Silas Vane? He asked. You know the name. Most folks west of the river do. Owns cattle, store notes, half the hay meadows in town, and the other half through men too afraid to admit whose brand they're carrying. Millie had drifted closer, listening with her whole small body. Ruth wished she hadn't heard so much, but wishes were for softer lives. A buckboard came rattling up the lane just before noon, polished enough to look insolent beside the ruins. Silas Vane stepped down from it in a dark coat that had never known honest work. He was 50 if he was a day, broad across the middle, neatly shaved, with a voice smooth enough to make lies sound charitable. Mrs. Calder, he said, removing his hat. I heard. Terrible business. Just terrible. Ruth did not invite him nearer. Vane's gaze moved over the wreckage, then to Millie, then to Elias, lingering there half a beat. I came as soon as word reached town. Thought perhaps you might need supplies. Credit, if necessary. We won't take yours. Be reasonable. His voice stayed soft. A woman and a child can't winter here now. Sell me the South Spring and lower pasture. Enough to settle your tax arrears and put a roof over your heads somewhere civilized. Ruth felt Millie stiffen beside her. My taxes were paid in March, Ruth said. Vane gave a sad little shrug, the sort men used when they wished to appear patient with a woman they considered difficult. County says otherwise. Ruth took the altered notices from her apron pocket and held them up between two blackened fingers. County's been using the wrong ink. Then, for the first time, something sharp showed under his good manners. Elias said mildly, Seems a hard morning to bargain land from the burnt. Vane turned to him. And you are? Passing through. Then pass. Vane looked back at Ruth. I'll give you until noon tomorrow before the claim is filed. After that, it goes beyond kindness and into law. He put his hat back on and climbed into the buckboard. As he turned the team, he said without looking back, some losses teach a person to accept help when it's offered. Ruth watched the wagon rattle away. That man could talk sugar out of a peach. Elias was staring at the wheel ruts. Those tires picked up coal oil mud from town. Fresh. Ruth looked at him sharply. He crouched by the track, touched the damp edge, and rubbed finger to thumb. I've smelled enough lamp fuel on bad mornings to know it. How? He rose. Used to wear a badge. Ruth thought of Jonah's warning. Don't trust the badge. Used to, she said. By late afternoon they found Jonah. Not alive. Not even close. His horse came in first, reins dragging, flanks crusted white with dried sweat. Ruth knew the animal before it reached the yard. Jonah's bay gelding, Cooper, missing a bite scar from his right shoulder and shod 1 foot narrower than the rest, because Jonah was always promising to fix it proper and never did. The sight of that horse riderless put a cold hand around Ruth's spine. They followed the gelding half a mile down the east draw. Millie left behind with Daisy and strict orders not to move. The smell found them before the body did, blood, dust, and the sweet edge of decay under cottonwood leaves. Jonah lay crumpled in the dry wash where the bank dropped off toward the creek bed, one arm under him, one flung wide. There was a bullet hole under his collarbone. The fall had broken his neck after the shot. Ruth made no sound at all. She went down into the wash, knelt in the dirt, and touched her brother's shirt where it was stiff with dried blood. He had been 28. He still whistled through his teeth when he mended wire. He had once ridden 12 miles in sleet to bring Millie peppermint because she'd lost her first tooth and thought the Tooth Fairy had forgotten Indian territory existed. Elias stood above her with his hat in both hands. They shot him before he hit the bank, he said quietly. Ruth looked up. You can tell that. The blood spread wrong for a fall wound. She nodded once. Useful fact. Terrible fact. Still fact. In Jonah's coat pocket they found nothing but a jackknife and 6 cents. Whatever else he'd carried was gone. Ruth rose slowly, dust clinging to her knees. Grief was there now, hot and clean and unbearable. But under it, something else had begun to form. Harder than grief. Better used to it. He rode to save us, she said. Elias's expression did not change, but his voice did. Then let's not waste what he bought. That was the point of no return. They buried Jonah at sunset under the cottonwoods above the creek. Not deep enough for family, perhaps, but as deep as burned hands and one tired stranger could manage before dark. Millie set the scorched skillet upside down at the head of the grave until Ruth could find or make a proper marker. The air smelled of turned earth and ash. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote called and another answered. Ruth stood with dirt on her skirt and Jonah's note in her pocket and understood something simple at last. If she walked away now, Silas Vane would own not only her land but the story of what had happened on it. In the morning, Elias packed his bedroll and said he could take Millie south to Ruth's cousin in Los Animas. Safe roof. School if she wanted it. A place beyond Vane's reach. Ruth was kneading biscuit dough from the last clean flour when he said it, and for one full breath the easy road opened before her. Let the child go. Sell the spring. Live. Bury the dead and accept the world as it clearly was. Millie looked from one to the other, saying nothing. Ruth wiped flour from her wrist. No. Elias leaned one shoulder against the broken doorframe. No to sending her. No to all of it. Ruth. He burned my house. He killed Jonah. If I hand him the spring, I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I helped him finish the job. He owns the sheriff. Then I'll go around the sheriff. He owns Judge Harrow too, by the look of that ledger scrap. Then I'll go around the judge. With what? One torn page and a note that came too late. With the truth and whatever else I can find before noon. He studied her a long moment. You always this stubborn? Millie answered before Ruth could. Worse. That drew the smallest ghost of a smile out of Elias. They rode into town just past 10, Ruth on Daisy, Elias beside her on a rangy sorrel that looked as worn in the joints as its rider. Millie stayed with Mrs. Inez Daugherty at the boarding house, a widow with a walnut cane and a habit of speaking as if everyone in the room were slightly deaf and somewhat foolish. If there was a safer place in Mercy Crossing, Ruth did not know it. The town reacted to Ruth like people do to a storm that might yet turn toward them. Some offered coffee and wouldn't meet her eyes. Some touched her sleeve and muttered about tragedy. Some stepped clean across the boardwalk to avoid being seen near her at all. At the blacksmith shed, Amos Pike wiped soot from his beard with the back of his wrist and said, 3 of Vane's men bought coal oil Thursday. More than any decent man needs unless he plans to light the night on purpose. Will you say that out loud? Ruth asked. Amos glanced toward the street, where Vane's clerk was loading feed sacks into a wagon. Depends who's asking. At noon tomorrow, maybe me. He hesitated. Then he gave one short nod. Maybe yes. At the doctor's office, old Dr. Fenwick peered at Jonah's wound note and said the shot had been taken from above and behind. Execution more than quarrel, he muttered. If you aim to make trouble with this, make it where people are listening. I'm too old to whisper facts into the ground. At the mercantile, the post clerk named Benny Creel kept wiping the same patch of counter until the wood shone wet under his rag. He would not meet Ruth's eyes. Not once. When she asked where Jonah's earlier letters had gone, he said he didn't know. When Elias laid the ledger scrap on the counter and tapped the line marked delayed dispatch, Benny's hand started shaking so badly he knocked over the inkwell. By noon they had enough pieces to know what had happened and not enough to prove it in a room ruled by men who preferred paper over pain. Vane had blocked notices, altered tax amounts, arranged the fire, and used Jonah's ride back as an opportunity to shut his mouth forever. Everyone knew it. Knowing and proving were different animals. They sat behind the livery in the thin shade of a hay wagon while Elias cleaned Ruth's burned hands with water that stung like fire all over again. She hissed and tried to pull back. He held steady. You'd rather face bullets than carbolic, he said. I know where bullets belong. Do you? She looked at him. What does that mean? He wrapped one hand in clean muslin torn from his own shirt. Means I've seen people stand up to evil easier than they'd let somebody help them. Ruth looked away toward the street. A freight wagon clattered past. Somewhere nearby, somebody was frying onions in lard. The smell made her stomach remember hunger. You said you used to wear a badge, she said. Deputy. 3 counties west. And I got good at bringing in men after the damage was done. Folks called me dependable. My wife called me gone too often. He tied the bandage neatly and sat back. One winter I rode after horse thieves instead of staying home through a hard storm. Figured duty mattered. Came back to smoke and a collapsed roof. Lantern tipped. Or so they told me. By the time I learned whose men had been seen near my place, the trail was cold and the man behind it too rich to name without proof. Ruth let that settle between them. Vain? She asked. Elias nodded once. For a while they listened to the town move around them. Then he said, very quietly, Grief's just love with no place left to go. Give it work, or it'll turn mean inside you. Ruth looked down at the fresh bandage on her hand. It was the truest thing anyone had said to her since Ben died. By evening, a fresh notice went up outside the courthouse. Special hearing, transfer of delinquent South Spring and Lower Pasture, Calder holding, noon tomorrow. The storm was arriving. As they rode back toward the burned ranch, the sky had gone copper over the plains and the shadows and the draws were filling with blue. Millie met them at the lane on foot, face pale and breathless. 2 riders came to the boarding house, she said. Mrs. Doherty hit one with her cane. I bit the other and ran. Ruth slid from the saddle so fast her boot heel snapped a dry weed stem clean in 2. Did they touch you? Millie shook her head. No, ma'am. Elias scanned the ridge lines. They're moving faster. That night, by the little cook fire they built from unburned fence pieces, Ruth unfolded Jonah's note for the 100th time and saw what grief had missed. Take Millie and the deed copy from under the loft stone. The deed copy had been there, but Jonah wrote as a man who expected more than one thing to be hidden. The phrase sat wrong in her head until it suddenly didn't. She stood up so fast the coffee pot rattled. The loft. The Pigeon loft by moonlight looked even deader than it had in day, but Ruth went straight to the rear footing and began scraping ash from the foundation seam with the blade of Jonah's jackknife. Elias knelt beside her. Millie held the lantern. At the far corner, tucked behind the stone where only a person who had built the place would think to look, Ruth found a narrow tin tobacco box. Inside were 2 folded telegraph copies, a bank draft with Vane's signature, and a sworn statement Jonah had written but never delivered. It named names. Sheriff Galt, Judge Harrow, Benny Creel. It named the Thursday coal oil purchase and the Friday ride. It named Silas Vane as the man who ordered all of it. Elias exhaled slowly. This could hang him. Ruth stared at the papers in her lap, hands trembling not with fear now, but something larger and stranger. Tomorrow, she said. Elias looked toward the dark hills. Tomorrow, then. And if you'd like to tell me true, right there in the middle of it all, what would you have done in Ruth's place? Sent the child away and taken the money, or stayed and fought a man who owned the town? I think a lot of us know our answer only when the fire is already behind us. They set out before dawn for Mercy Crossing. Ruth pinned Jonah's sworn statement into the lining of her bodice, tucked the telegraph copies into Millie's stocking, and tied the bank draft beneath Daisy's saddle pad. If Vane wanted proof, he would have to strip them all bare in the street to get it. He tried before they were halfway there. 3 riders came out of the cut bank south of the old relay shed, hard and fast, faces tied off with dust cloths, though no one riding honest bothered with such nonsense at that hour. Elias saw the sun flash on one rifle barrel and shouted once. Down! The first shot snapped over Ruth's shoulder. Millie screamed. Daisy plunged sideways. Then the world got short and sharp. Hooves. Dust. Another shot. Elias drove his sorrel across Ruth's path and fired from the saddle. One masked rider pitched backward. Another swung wide for Millie's pony. Ruth rose in her stirrups, leaned across empty air, and caught the pony's trailing lead just as a third rider lunged to cut it. The rope burned through her bandaged palm. She held anyway. Ride, Elias barked. They tore toward the relay shed, a squat old stone building left from the stage road days, half-roofed and useless to anyone but snakes and desperate people. Another shot cracked. The door splintered as Ruth shoved Millie inside. Elias came in last, dragged the warped plank shut, and dropped the crossbar into place. Blood was running down his left sleeve. Hit? Ruth asked. Grazed. Outside. Horses circled. Men shouted. One laughed. Silas Vane's voice floated through the gaps in the boards, calm as Sunday supper. Mrs. Calder, open the door, and I'll let the child walk away. Millie went white. Ruth moved in front of her. You burned my house. You had something I wanted. You killed my brother. He made himself troublesome. Beside Ruth, Elias cocked the hammer back on his revolver. His face had gone still in the dangerous way of men who have reached the end of argument. Then Vane said, I also have Mrs. Doherty's cook tied to a cottonwood, and 2 more men headed for your pigeon birds. We can keep doing sums all morning, but you're running out of numbers. Ruth's heart struck once against her ribs. The pigeons. The second attack came at the back wall. Hatchets into old timber. Wood flying inward in gray blades. Elias fired through the gap, and somebody howled. Millie had both hands over her mouth to keep quiet. A board gave way. Light knife through. Ruth's fingers went to the hidden seam in her bodice and then stopped. If she surrendered the papers, Vane would kill them anyway. If she kept them, he might kill them faster. That was the shape of the choice. Not good or bad. Death one way. Possible justice the other. She looked at Millie. Then at Elias. He met her eyes and understood before she spoke. Get the child out the roof, he said. There is no roof. There's enough. He shoved a feed crate under the rear wall where part of the stone had settled away from the rafters. Smoke-black daylight showed through a jagged opening high enough for a thin person. Millie could fit. Ruth maybe. Elias likely not with his bad leg and bleeding arm. No, Ruth said. His mouth did the smallest thing, not quite a smile. That girl lives. Argue later. Outside, Vane's men hit the front door together. The bar bowed inward. Elias fired twice more. Silence answered, then a curse. Ruth boosted Millie onto the crate. Go through. Run to the creek cut. Don't look back. Millie clung to her for one fierce second. Aunt Ruth. Go. The girl wriggled up through the gap and vanished. Ruth turned to Elias. He was reloading with bloody fingers. You too, he said. She took the bank draft from beneath Daisy's saddle pad, where she had tucked it in the shed corner, and jammed it into his coat. If I go, you go. The door burst inward. What followed happened in pieces too quick for memory to hold smooth. Elias firing from one knee. A masked man falling across the threshold. Ruth grabbing a shovel handle and bringing it down on another man's wrist so hard the gun flew loose. Vane stepping through the dust with his own revolver drawn. Expensive boots dark with stable mud. Enough, he said. Elias had no clear shot. Neither did Ruth. Vane's gaze flicked to Ruth's torn bodice where the hidden papers no longer sat flat. He smiled with one corner of his mouth. There you are. He took one step nearer, and Ruth saw the split-knuckle scar on the foreman behind him, exactly where Jonah's note had promised. Then a whistle sounded from outside. Hi. Shrill. Millie. All the horses in the yard answered at once. Daisy screamed. A rider lost his seat. Another horse slammed sideways into the relay door, knocking Vane hard against the jamb. In that one broken second, Ruth moved. She did not think. She swung the shovel handle like an axe and caught Vane across the temple. He staggered. Elias surged up and drove his shoulder into the foreman. The gun went off into the ceiling. Ruth ran. Not away. Toward the horses. Daisy was rearing wild-eyed in the yard with rope trailing from her halter. Ruth caught that rope, spun once, and sent the loop sailing. Years of throwing lines in wind and dark and calving mud put it true. The rope snapped tight around Vane's gun arm, just as he lunged from the doorway after her. Ruth wrapped the tail around the hitch post and threw her weight back. Vane hit the ground face first in the dust. By the time his men regrouped, Millie had come back with Amos Pike, Mrs. Doherty's wagon driver, and 3 ranch hands from Up Valley who had finally found a use for their courage. The masked riders broke first. Bad men usually do when they realize the crowd has stopped being scared. Vane did not break. He spat blood, pushed himself to his knees, and said to Ruth in a voice meant only for her, You think a town like this will choose you over money? Ruth looked down at him. No, she said. I think they'll choose themselves over you. The quiet after violence came in a sheep camp cabin borrowed from Amos on the ridge east of town. Elias sat shirtless on a stool while Ruth cleaned the graze in his arm by lantern light. Millie slept in the bunk under 2 blankets, one fist still curled as if ready to fight in her dreams. Outside, the night had gone still. Inside, coffee simmered low and the cabin smelled of pine pitch, wool, and clean blood. Elias sucked air through his teeth when Ruth poured whiskey over the wound. "That for the cut," she said. "Or for me?" "Both." She bandaged him carefully. He washed her hands. "I was wrong this morning," he said. "About what?" "Thought you were staying because you couldn't let go." Ruth tied the knot and sat back. "And now?" "Now I think you stayed because you knew the land wasn't the real thing being stolen." She looked at the sleeping shape of Millie in the bunk. Ben used to say a place takes its shape from who is loved there. I did not understand that when he was alive. Thought keeping the roof up was the same as keeping a home. Elias leaned forward, elbows on knees. "Most of us learn too late." Her throat tightened. "When Ben took sick, he asked me once whether I would leave if the place ever got too hard. I told him no, like it was a vow worth admiring. He died hearing me choose dirt over mercy." Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Home ain't the house that burns. It's the hand that still reaches for yours in the dark." Ruth closed her eyes. There it was, the thing under all the smoke and anger and ruined timber. Not the ranch, not even vengeance, though God knew she wanted it. It was this terrible stubborn hope that maybe a life could be broken open and still hold something worth living inside it. When she opened her eyes, Elias was still there. Tired, wounded, waiting with the kind of patience only grief teaches. She touched the old pale scar along his wrist. "Did nobody ever tell you you talk too true for a drifter?" "Once or twice." She laughed then, softly so as not to wake Millie, and the sound startled her with how long it had been since it lived in her body. He reached into his vest pocket and brought out a tarnished deputy's star. One point was bent. "I kept this to remind myself what failing looked like," he said. "I don't need it anymore." Ruth took the badge and turned it in the light. Then she slipped Jonah's jackknife from her own pocket and set it in his palm. "He would have liked you," she said. Their fingers stayed together longer than either pretended was accidental. If this part of the story is catching you in the chest a little, then you are exactly who it was meant for. Leave a like, subscribe if you want more of these long roads and hard-won endings, and know there are a lot of us out here who still believe quiet hearts deserve stories too. At dawn, Ruth climbed to the rebuilt corner of the old loft where 3 surviving pigeons huddled in a crate Amos had fetched from town. She copied Jonah's statement by lamplight until her wrist ached, then tied the pages into brass tubes. One for the army post at Bent Creek, where a postal inspector was rumored to be visiting. One for the Denver paper that printed scandal with holy enthusiasm, and one for a cattlemen's association office that hated Silas Vane almost as much as it feared him. "You trust birds more than men?" Elias asked. Ruth stroked the neck of the gray cock bird before releasing him. "Today," she said, "I trust anything that knows how to come home." By noon the courthouse yard was full. Vane had expected that. Public takings played better before witnesses. He stood on the platform outside Judge Harrow's office in a black coat and fresh shave, one temple purple under the powder he'd used to hide where Ruth had struck him. Sheriff Galt lounged near the door with his thumbs in his belt and the bored look of a man who thought the ending had already been bought. Ruth came up the street on Daisy with Millie beside her and Elias walking on the other side, because his arm would not let him ride steady. The crowd parted the way water does around stone. Judge Harrow adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. "By county authority and in settlement of unpaid tax." "My taxes were paid," Ruth said. Harrow frowned. "This is not your speaking time." "It became my speaking time when your friends burned my house." A murmur moved through the crowd. Vane's smile did not. Ruth dismounted slowly. Every eye in Mercy Crossing was on her now. Shopkeepers, drovers, church ladies, hired hands, boys with dust on their knees, widows with hard mouths, men who had once borrowed seed from Ben Calder and forgotten to repay it when he died. Good, she thought. Let them watch. She climbed the platform steps and faced them all. My brother Jonah sent warning Friday night that Silas Vane had bought Sheriff Galt and meant to burn my ranch for the South Spring. The Pigeon arrived Monday. 2 days too late to save the buildings, but not too late to save the truth. Vane spread his hands. A grieving woman's tale. Ruth held up the altered tax notices. Different ink. Then the bank draft. his signature. Then Jonah's statement, unfolded at last from where it had ridden against her skin, and the names of every man he paid to do it. Galt shifted his weight. Judge Harrow blanched, but reached anyway for the papers. Vane spoke over him, too fast and too sharp now. That note's a forgery. Jonah had no chance to loose a Pigeon Friday. My men. He stopped. Nobody moved, not even the flies. Ruth heard Amos Pike suck in one delighted breath from somewhere below the platform. Your men what? She asked. Vane's face changed then. Polite mask on. Something nakedly cruel underneath. You think cleverness makes you equal to me? No, Ruth said. I think confession does. The first pigeon returned before anyone else reached the thought of stopping her. It came down out of the white noon sky and landed right on the courthouse roof ridge, chest flashing silver in the sun. People pointed. Then hooves sounded from the north road. 2 army riders entered the square at a hard trot, dust rolling behind them. One wore a blue coat gone shiny at the seams. The other carried a leather dispatch satchel stamped U.S. Mail. The inspector was a spare woman with iron-gray hair under a broad hat. She reined in below the platform and looked up at Ruth first, not the judge. Mrs. Calder, she called. Ruth nodded. Your bird reached Bent Creek at 10:15. Interference with mail dispatch, destruction of routed notice, and tampering with carrier service fall under federal charge when connected to contract routes. She turned her horse toward Vane and Galt. No one leaves. Galt's hand dropped to his revolver. Elias said, very softly, don't. Galt drew anyway. He got as far as leather before Elias slammed Jonah's jackknife through the gun belt knot at his hip. The holster dropped clean to the boards. Amos Pike, who had perhaps been waiting years for a reason, hit the sheriff from the side like a blacksmith swinging a gate. Vane ran. He leapt from the platform to the hitch rail, tore loose a bay gelding, and hauled himself into the saddle one-handed. People shouted. Horses plunged. Judge Harrow vanished indoors with the speed of a man who had suddenly remembered urgent paperwork. Ruth was already moving. She snatched a coiled lead rope from the rail, sprang onto Daisy bareback, and drove her straight through the gap Vane had opened in the crowd. Wind tore at her hair. The square blurred. Ahead, Vane kicked the gelding hard toward the bridge over Sand Creek, maybe thinking open country still belonged to men like him. He did not know Ruth's horse. Daisy stretched under her like thrown water, fast and furious and listening for the pressure of Ruth's knees. They gained on Vane by the grain shed. By the bridge, Ruth could see the sweat dark on the back of his coat. He looked over his shoulder, saw her coming, and drew a small pistol from his pocket. Ruth leaned flat to Daisy's neck as he fired. The shot cracked past her ear. Then she rose in the stirrups and cast. The rope opened in the air clean as a prayer. It dropped over Vane's right shoulder and caught under his arms. Ruth dally-wrapped once around the saddle horn and shouted Daisy to the side. The jerk ripped Vane backward out of the saddle, so hard his boots flew free of the stirrups. He hit the dirt at the bridge approach and skidded into the wheel ruts in a cloud of white dust and creek grit. By the time he rolled over choking, Ruth was off Daisy and standing over him with the pistol he had dropped. Jonah rode home for us, she said. You don't get to ride away. When the army riders reached them, Vane had blood in his mouth and fear in his eyes for the first time anyone in Mercy Crossing had ever seen. Not fear of dying. Smaller men feel that early. This was fear of consequence, of losing the protection wealth had always built around him. He looked past Ruth toward town, where people were gathering at the bridge rail, watching. My property, he started, will be inventoried, the postal inspector said as she dismounted. Your account's frozen, pending territorial review. Your sheriff is disarmed. Your judge is under inquiry. Your clerk is singing already. Vane turned his head toward Ruth, hatred burning through the dust on his face. You were nothing. A widow on borrowed time. Ruth lowered the pistol and stepped closer so only he could hear her answer. That's the trouble with men like you, she said. You only know how to count what can be bought. By autumn the South Spring was running through new-cut channels, and a fresh frame house stood where the burned one had been, smaller than the first but better placed against winter wind. Judge Harrow resigned before the inquiry ended. Benny Creel testified for leniency and spent the next 10 years sorting mail under supervision in a town that did not trust him with secrets. Sheriff Galt left in chains. Silas Vane lost his cattle contracts, his land claims, his store notes, and finally his freedom. Mercy Crossing, which had bent so long it had forgotten how to stand, found its spine one citizen at a time. Months later, on a blue evening smelling of frost and wood smoke, Millie sat on the new porch reading aloud while pigeons rustled in the rebuilt loft and Elias mended a latch Ruth had already told him twice was hanging fine. Ruth stood in the doorway with flour on her forearms and watched the two of them in the falling light. Turns out a place can die clear down to the foundation and still leave enough living behind to build a home. The last of the sun lay across the new roof and the pigeon loft, turning the whole little ranch the color of warm bread. Next time, we'll tell the story of a deaf seamstress sent west as payment on a debt, and the one-eyed rancher who was the first man to listen closely enough to hear everything she meant.